Hello, everyone. This is Michael W., host of the Pound for Pound Boxing Report and senior writer for Three Kings Boxing. On May the 1st, yours truly had the honor of interviewing Hall of Fame boxing announcer Al Bernstein. Among the things that we discussed was his latest project. He's writing a book right now about the life of former light heavyweight champion Eddie Mustafa Muhammad. We also talked about boxing being grounded due to COVID-19 slash coronavirus and what adjustments the sport will have to make once things get back to quote unquote normal. We also talked about Fury Wilder trilogy, what has been the keys to his success and longevity over the years, and his criteria for what makes a good boxing color commentator. All that and more here. Special episode of Pound for Pound Boxing Report and Three Kings Boxing. This is Michael from Pound for Pound Boxing Report and senior writer from Three Kings Boxing. Um, and have a special guest with me. It's really an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to interview this gentleman. I don't want to make him sound too old because I'm old myself, but I began listening to this gentleman commentating, covering boxing as a kid in the 90s. I watched him throughout ESPN. He's now the ringside reporter on Showtime. Ladies and gentlemen, hardcore boxing geeks and all those alike, the one and only Al Bernstein. What's going on, Mr. Bernstein?
Well, it's good to be with you. Please call me Al. And this is everything's going good. We're just all trying to, get through the current situation and do what we can, and hope that the sports and, of course, more importantly, our society comes back strong.
Indeed. First of all, I want to thank Ada Zuckerman for her behind-the-scenes work of getting this interview together. This interview came about basically by chance. I saw you, Al, tweeting a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week it was, that you're in the process of writing a book on Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, former light heavyweight champion and now trainer. And I just simply responded to you, and you agreed to do the interview. First and foremost, what was the process behind you writing a book on Mr. Muhammad?
Well, some people that had been associated with Eddie, and I've known Eddie for a long time. A lot of I guess they chatted with Eddie about they wanted to do a book and someone to do it with him, and he suggested that he would like if we could work together on it, and they came to me, and I've been asked to do this, oh God, maybe 10 or 12 times before, and I've never really done it. It's just been my schedule and things I'm up to. This is a time consuming kind of an endeavor, and I just never felt able to commit to that with anyone, and I've always turned it down. But in this case, Eddie is a special guy, and I felt that it would be a story worth telling, and they really wanted me to do it, so I said yes. And it's always been a delight because it's great to work with Eddie, and I think he's got an interesting story to tell, and we're doing it in the form of it's called Lessons Learned, and we're doing it in the form of him telling a lesson before every chapter that he learned, and kind of conveying how that lesson became known to him through, either something that happened in his career or in his life.
Will this be a time period of his entire life, or is the book focused on a specific time during his life?
No, we're going to talk about it. It's about his, when he was during his career and during him as a trainer, and some about his youth. But for the most part, it's about the period that he's been, a public figure, and there are personal stories, of course, in the book about his life as well.
Most folks know Eddie Mustafa Muhammad just from a training capacity, particularly younger boxing fans. But for those in the know and those who really watch the sport or go back and watch archival footage, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad came from one of the best eras in the history of the sport, the 1970s.
Yes.
And he came from an outstanding, like heavyweight era of that decade with people like Spinks, people like John Conte, Galindez, and others.
Yeah, Yaki
Talk,
Lopez,
inform the fans.
Matthew Saad Muhammad, so many great fighters, yeah.
Right, inform the fans for those who do not know in terms of Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, the fighter himself.
Yeah, he was, you mentioned that era. It was literally the best era. The 70s and into the 80s was, most boxing historians will probably say that that's the best era ever for the light heavyweight division. There was a great era, of course, with Archie Moore and Ezra Charles and those people. But this division was deeper. There were so many. You could, at any given time in the 70s and into the 80s, you could look down to what you might consider the number 12, 13, or 14 light heavyweight in the world, and know that that fighter was terrific. So it was a great division, and Eddie was, he became champion. He fought a number of the best fighters in that era, and Eddie was, as a fighter, he was a terrific puncher, huge right hand, a very good body puncher. In his championship win over Marvin Johnson, it was the body work that more than anything
that body shot capacitated Johnson. That took him down and out.
Marvin Johnson years later, and they were joking, and Marvin said, "You hurt me to the body." They laughed, but yeah, those body punches were amazing. So he was a very solid fighter, and had tremendous power.
Yeah, even folks like Rossman and Yaki Lopez and Matthew Saad Muhammad, who may have been the most exciting fighter maybe in the last 50 years. So yeah, he came from a great era. I'm not going to ask you to give up too much details, but we live in a post 9/11 era where, I'll just go there. If you're a Muslim, you kind of looked at differently pre 9/11 and post 9/11.
Yeah, interesting you're bringing that up. Go ahead, finish your question.
He along with Matthew Franklin, aka now Matthew Saad Muhammad, Dwight Muhammad Qawi, came from an era where you had a lot of fighters, black fighters in particular, who made the conversion from Christianity to Islam. Did you get into how that informed him as a fighter and even post-fighter in terms of today?
Yeah, very much so. And the interesting thing about it, and I can't speak to it with everyone, but I can with his in his situation. There are a couple interesting things about it. His brother and sister had converted to Islam before Eddie did, and he had become really good friends with Muhammad Ali just before he was getting ready to fight Marvin Johnson for the championship, and he did his first training camp at Deer Lake, and Ali has been set up by mutual friends of theirs, and he'd never met Ali, and he went to that camp, and ironically, even though Ali, of course, was a follower of Islam, he never proselytized Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, and in fact, Ali didn't really do that. But being around Ali and kind of seeing his example and everything was one of the tipping points that, even though Eddie had already kind of was leaning in that direction to make the conversion, that was kind of one of the tipping points that led him there. And he felt very much that, he does feel it's the most important thing he's done in his life for him personally as a human being, that has made a enormous difference in him as a person, and felt that was the missing piece for him. And it was, and ironically, the other thing that I've talked to him a lot about as we've moved on in this is the Ali, while he faced, enormous blowback from that, and of course that was linked in many people's minds to his his refusal to serve in the armed forces during the Vietnam conflict. He and other athletes that had converted faced more difficult times. Eddie has said, and I've asked this question of him 10 different ways. He faced very little, and to this day, he said, has faced very little unreasonable or how can I put it? Well, prejudice, if you will, over that decision. And I found that interesting. Not within the boxing community, and he said in general, outside it. So I think that's kind of interesting because which is not to suggest, obviously, that that kind of prejudice doesn't exist. It does, and he's keenly aware of the existence of it. But from his standpoint, he just hasn't faced it as it relates to his career, and even back when he did make the conversion, he didn't face it. And in fact, when doing research on the book, looking for times where it looked like there was people writing that would have been insensitive to it, it really didn't exist.
I mentioned Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, the fighter. I wanted to go back from that era to now him as a trainer. Most people look at him and say the work that he did recently with Badu Jab, bringing him up to the title. For me, personally, the standout moment was how he resurrected the career of the Blade, Iran Barkley.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
From your perspective, being a longtime observer, interviewing fighters, watching things from ringside, what do you think makes Eddie Mustafa Muhammad so good as a trainer?
Well, I think he will tell you that a big part of he gets fighters to believe in themselves. That's number one, and had to do that with Iran Barkley. He got him at a very low ebb, and he told Iran, "I will make you a two-time world champion." If you literally, he said two-time world champion, which is what Iran became after he, got with him. And he said, "You just need to believe in yourself." And part of the way that Eddie Mustafa Muhammad gets fighters to do that is by making the process more enjoyable. He believes that training, while it's hard and needs to be made easier by a convivial atmosphere and sometimes a funny atmosphere, and getting fighters to feel like the process is not as gruesome as as they might see it or as it can be. And that's a big part of his approach. Obviously, the other part is he knows he's a great student of boxing. He believes that one size does not fit all, so he works with the strengths of the fighters he has. And while there are certain things that are, he believes he's a big believer that no matter who you are, and he's always believed that the jab is the essential punch in boxing, and you have to try to do that as best you can. And Iran is a perfect example of a fighter that who had an underused jab, and he helped him make it better. So the resurrection of Iran's career, which was he was really the first fighter that Eddie really trained, and that remains to this day, Eddie believes, one of the more remarkable accomplishments he's had as a trainer.
Yeah, because when Barkley when he got defeated by Ben, coming off of detached retina, people thought it was over. And then the next thing you know, he had some fights, and then put him in the ring with Van Horn. You saw what he did there. You saw what he did in the rematch with Hearns. And then, he became a mainstream, a hot name in the sport, which ultimately led up to the fight with Tony, so.
It was pretty remarkable. And Iran Barkley is one of those fighters, when you look back at his whole resume, his whole career, he did remarkable things. Before, during, and after though the part with Eddie was a big success for him, but he did some amazing things. He was just a very, very good fighter, and but for a few breaks here and there, and you can still make the case that he might be a Hall of Fame fighter, but he was just, you know, really an amazing, and I believe to this day, by the way, that he won the Duran fight.
Oh my goodness! The way he performed against in that loss, remarkable. I mean, take away the knockdown, he was outstanding in that fight.
Well, yeah, I announced that fight with Gil Clancy. I did play-by-play, and Gil was doing the color. And I just think if you take it round by round and you go back and look at the rounds, I'm again 10-8 round for the knockdown. I find it hard to see that Duran won enough rounds to win the fight. You know, I didn't score it at that time round by round. I've since gone back, and I just think that Iran won that fight. You know, and I think look, it's the classic case, and you can look at the Leonard Hagler fight a little bit like that as well, where somebody overperforms from where you think they're going to. Barkley was the favorite in that fight. Most people didn't think Duran could get up to middleweight and do what he did at that age, and he did perform very well in that fight, Duran. But you can't look at it through that lens. You have to look at it through who is winning the rounds.
In other words, because people thought that Duran was aged because he was smaller, they didn't think he would do well, and because he exceeded expectations, he may have been given more benefit of the doubt by the judges.
Right, precisely, and I think that is what happened in that fight. And you know, I actually thought Iran Barkley fought one of his best fights that night. He was, you know, superb.
What is the process right now in terms of the book on Mustafa Muhammad, and when can we anticipate it in stores?
You know, I'm trying to get it finished now, and then we're going to be talking to the publishers. So it's going to be a little while, but I'm hoping to finish things up in the next month or two here, and then hopefully they can do the turnaround that doesn't take too long.
Let's transition into now in terms current boxing matters. The sport has been grounded, at least inside of the ring, due to coronavirus / COVID-19, the virus, the worldwide pandemic. I've asked fighters in terms of how they've reacted and adjusted. I want to ask you, as someone who's, in a sense, busier than the fighters. You're at ringside all the time, covering for Showtime. You're either interviewing or being interviewed. Your schedule is very busy. From you in the media, from you, someone who's at ringside covering a multitude of fights throughout the year, really throughout the month, how has life been for you, from your perspective, dealing with this pandemic?
Well, you know, part of the thing is that while I haven't been out there doing the, you know, announcing boxing matches and doing all that, because of the book I've been working on, and because I started a new podcast, which has just gotten out there, Bernstein Unplugged, I've been busy, and I've been doing a lot of things. So I've been home, but I've been working on a number of different things. And so the main difference has been not going away and doing actual fights. And, you know, I think the question for everybody is, you know, we're all dealing with this. We all have have personal issues, some more than others, because of the economic disadvantage of this and the unprecedented way in which we have to live our lives that has never quite been the case before. So we're all, you know, trying to cope with that. So for me, that part of it, the part as a person, is essentially the same as everybody else. From a professional standpoint, because I've been busy with these other projects, I've had a pretty full plate.
This is Michael W. From Pound for Pound Box Report, senior writer for Three Kings Boxing, and I'm being joined by Al Bernstein. Speaking in terms of the sport and how it'll react, how do you think, hopefully, should boxing in the ring come back on a regular basis? Hopefully we return to a quote-unquote normalcy. How do you think the
I think
sport will adjust, both in terms of the economic side, the managers and promoters, in reaction to maybe the fans? The reason I ask that, because there's surely going to be a financial hit. Things will never be the same in terms of, even in your position ringside, fans, how the event is coordinated and staged. People outside, viewers may suffer a financial hit, may not be able to have the money once this is over. Hopefully, this ends
right.
soon. Your reaction, your thought on how boxing itself, the sport in its entirety, inside, outside, business, economics, will adjust.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. There's the immediate question of how you logistically bring the sport back, and then there's those larger questions that you alluded to. As far as bringing it back is concerned, I think we're likely to see boxing come back in the summer, probably in June, with no audience, and I think promoters and networks will be picking out a location or a couple locations where they feel they can do this safely and where they can somehow house the fighters safely. Obviously, a big part of it is going to be testing everybody that is involved in it, whether the officials, the fighters, the trainers and their staff, the broadcast people. Those people are going to have to be tested, and the proper social distancing is going to have to be observed. That's not an impossible task, and while it'll take some effort. I think that part can be done, and once that's done, I think boxing there will be a fair amount of boxing over the couple months that after once it starts up, and I think it's going to be without. I would think it would be without fans for a fair amount of time. Some of that will be determined on how well we do as a society in dealing with COVID-19, and whether there's a reemergence in the fall, which some people suggest, some of the medical people are suggesting, is a distinct possibility. So those are all questions that will, be a part of the coming back. Now, in the larger sense, you talk about, for instance, will people have money to even pay for a pay-per-view match later this year, if there is such a thing? I know they just announced that Leo Santa Cruz and Gervonta Davis are going to fight probably in the calendar year this year, and that's likely to be a pay-per-view event. So that would be one where we would find out what kind of pricing could you put on a pay-per-view event, given the fact that people's economic issues are not going to just magically go away because they've gotten back to work, or maybe their situation has improved somewhat. So there are going to be a lot of questions for boxing, like every sport, to answer in terms of that. I do think we will. I don't think those effects will be forever. I think that clearly when we head into next year, at a certain point in the sport of boxing, while fighters are going to have to probably find a way to take less of a fee, maybe the broadcasting rights fees will be different. The question is, how will ticket prices be? All those things are going to have to be adjusted, but adjusted on a per event basis and on a per promoter basis, per fighter basis, per network basis. And I don't think in that one there'll be a one size fits all either. But those are all issues that everybody individually, companies, are going to have to come to grips with.
Do you think there will be an adjustment in terms of ringside commentary? And I say that because you're at a vantage point where you cannot just, in a sense, feel the concussive impact of the blows, but it's nothing for you to have sweat, maybe even blood sprayed your way from a punch or whatever. Given the unconcerns about this virus, do you think that maybe once the sport returns, that they may position you at a different locale so you will not put yourself in danger?
We might not be ringside. We might be, a little bit back. There won't be a crowd, so who knows? Maybe they'll put us 5 or 6 feet back. We could be. The irony is, I work from a monitor anyway. Even sitting ringside, I do about 80% of my commentary interestingly, I look at the monitor because I want to see what people are seeing on TV. So I could be 30 feet back and it wouldn't really impact me dramatically. Um, but I think they'll probably maybe take some specific measure. And I think if they test you and you know you're free of it and you can be at a we're all going to distance to however we're supposed to distance both from each other and probably from the ring. You know, I think there might be some special adjustments made for that.
I'm going to ask about some action that took place before this pandemic rose and this outbreak and the sport being basically put on freeze. Before all of this happened, the big talk amongst the sport was Wilder Fury 2. Um, and the surprise of not that Fury won necessarily, but the way he won. Given us a couple of months to now sit back and ponder and reflect about what we all saw, your reaction to that, one. Two, do you think that Wilder should immediately go back on the rematch? And maybe could it be a case that, as weird as this say, that this time off due to pandemic may be a blessing in disguise? Because from what I understand, he was going to go back ASAP right back in the summer, and now it looks like the fight will not take place until at least October.
Yeah, well, two things. I did the first Wilder Fury fight. I announced that, and that one went more to form in a way because we would have expected Fury to box, which he did very effectively. Would have expected Deontay Wilder to have power. He did that. He came within 1 second of knocking Fury out. Fury amazingly got up from that second knockdown. Twice he had him down. That fight went more to form. The second fight, as you point out, while it certainly wasn't out of the question that Tyson Fury would win that fight, the way he won it was surprising to some, though apparently not to him, because he told us that's what he was going to do. We just weren't sure that it was the case. And so, as far as the third fight is concerned, I actually do believe that once Wilder made the decision that he was going to take the third fight because he had it contractually promised to him. I think this delay is probably beneficial to him because I think had he gone in sooner, if there were, it would give him less time for whatever tweaking he might want to do. He's talking now about bringing somebody in to help their camp, who I don't know. And so I think it might give him, if it's going to benefit either of those two fighters, my guess is it would benefit him a little bit more than Fury.
We began this discussion talking about Eddie Mustafa Muhammad in terms of the era he fought in, not just in terms of the decade, but the division. When you look at boxing landscape now in terms of divisions and whatever, and how stacked the division may be, what division do you look at and it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of reminiscent of what we saw in the 70s with the light heavyweights, in the 70s with the heavyweights and welterweights, in the 80s, in the 90s with the welterweights like Trinidad and De La Hoya and Corte and whatnot.
Well, if there's a division of the divisions now that there's a couple of divisions that have the potential for that. The 154-pound division is a great division. Depending on who moves up and who stays put, and there's a number of good fighters there. But the one division that has the potential to create something really extraordinary is a lightweight division. Depending again on who stays there and if they can fight each other. We already have had a fight on the board with Teofimo Lopez taking on Vasily Lomachenko. That had to be pushed back because of COVID-19, and we assume that fight is still going to happen at some point. Whether it's the first fight back for either of them, I don't know, but I believe that fight that fight will probably happen. Those two fighters, along with Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, and Gervonta Davis, you have in that group the amazing potential for some great, great fights. And then if you think of some fighters moving up, Leo Santa Cruz moving up to take on Davis. There's talk Gary Russell, though he doesn't fight very often, wants to be at 135. The 135-pound division has the potential to be a really great division for several years. And we'll see if that can happen. A lot of it is dependent on people fighting each other, how well they develop. All those main five fighters that I've mentioned, how good are they in fact? Are they as good as we think they are? And how will they be when they fight each other? So we'll find out.
And as a guy who really pays attention to a lot of weight divisions, I have to put in 115 pounds with Estrada, with Rung Lasai, Chocolatito, Kosei Tanaka, who many people don't know about. He's moving up to 115 pounds to fight Ioka. That division is stacked as well. You mentioned Gary Russell. I just have to ask this. Your thoughts on the fact that he maintains the stance of fighting once a year?
Well, I've interviewed him. We do a fighter meeting every time he fights. We've had his fights on Showtime, and he says the same thing every time. If there was another fight that he feels like people are avoiding him, and if there was another fight, a big fight that he could get, he would take it. He feels like he said, look, I am true to my family. I make a living for my family. I put them first. He works with all his young fighters and his brothers, and in his gym. And he said that's where my success or failure in life will come from. And that's where I will ultimately be judged. And that if I fight once a year or twice a year, as a man, I can look at myself and say that's how I want to be judged, which is his right. But the thing that, in my opinion, the only thing that means he can't do is talk about his boxing legacy in a way that would be presented in such a way that he has fought often and fought the best competition, because that has not been the case. Now, he would say the reason he hasn't fought the best competition is not because of him, but because of others. So that's his viewpoint of it. We'd all like to see Gary Russell in the ring more often. He's a very talented fighter, and he's interesting to watch. But to many people, it's a frustrating process.
Frustrating, I think that is the operative word here, because
it is. People want to see him fight.
He's just too good to be on the shelf and not fight more. Arguably the best in the world at 126 pounds. One guy that consistently gets mentioned when I interview fighters about other fighters, one guy that continues to get brought up is Naoya Inoue. Fighters, hardcore fans love him. From you in the media perspective, doing fights, covering fights, I would love to get your perspective on one Naoya Inoue.
Oh, well, he's great. I mean, now we saw him in what I thought might have been the best fight of the year against Nonito Donaire.
Yes.
In last year. I mean, it was a remarkable performance by Donaire, who, is an older fighter who people had been willing to write off, and then he came back and with some good performances, but I don't think anyone expected him to, and that was the ending of that tournament. I don't think people expected him to be as good as he was in that fight. And he was spectacular, and it produced one of the best fights, maybe the best fight of the year, and one of the best I've seen. Inoue is a very, very good fighter. He's powerful. He knows how to fight. He is not unbeatable, and we saw evidence of that in the Donaire fight. That he is not a completely unstoppable force, but he is fantastic. And I think, depending on, and as he'll probably matriculate up a little bit in weight class, and that'll be a true test, because will his power, but he showed in the Donaire fight that just because he couldn't knock somebody out didn't mean that he wasn't going to be effective.
And he showed toughness in that fight too, because he fought the majority of that bout with a fractured orbital bone. You mentioned he's not beatable. Who do you think has the greatest chance of defeating him?
I'm sorry?
Who do you think has the greatest chance to defeat him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on where he goes in terms of weight classes and how high he goes up. And I'm not sure who would be the best, the best person to beat him or not. I mean, again, it depends on. Probably it's going to come when he goes up a little bit in weight. So I'm not sure.
This is Michael W., Pound for Pound Boxing Report, senior writer for Three Kings Boxing. I'm being joined by Al Bernstein. Get ready to wrap up the conversation. And I want to wrap it up focusing on you. I mentioned how I watched you from the time I was a kid in the late 80s, early 90s. For me, the thing about you is not just your lasting power, it's your approach, your talent, and your skill. Looking back at you and kind of analyzing yourself, the Al Bernstein of say 1990, of 1995, what do you think is the key for your success? What do you think the key is for you to being able to still be in the game? And do you think you are a better ringside commentator now than you were 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yeah, those are good questions. I don't know if everyone does this, but I am a person, and I know a lot of people, who are writers and broadcasters, and not just in sports and in other endeavors as well. Some people don't want to over-evaluate their work. They whether it's broadcasting or writing, they feel I've done it. I don't want to dwell on it or dig into it. I'm just the opposite. I've almost never done I don't say never, but for the most part, I very seldom do a broadcast that I don't rewatch. I am always digging in to look at what I did and evaluate it and say, was that acceptable or not acceptable, and was that the best way for me to do it? And so I am a evaluator when it comes to my own work. So it's the kind of question that I would probably be able to address, whereas some people might say, well, they haven't dug into it. I've changed. I haven't changed my approach to broadcasting ever in the 40 years I've done it. My approach has always been essentially the same. My goal is to as a color, and then there's two different roles. I've been both the analyst and play-by-play broadcaster, and they are two different roles to me. But about 70% of what I've done has been in the analyst role, maybe 80%. So in that role, I've always approached it the same way, where I want to get as much information as possible on the broadcast. My job is to analyze the action, provide anecdotal information, and and statistical information and whatever else I can to buttress what I'm saying or points about the fight or the fighters that will make sense. And then my third goal there is to make the fight interesting for people without overselling it or without or going into overly opinionated situations. And so that's always been my approach. Now, when I look back at different times of announcing, there have been times when I have relied more on anecdotal material or statistical material. Times when I'm not known as a hyperbolic announcer anyway, so I've never been one for a lot of hyperbole. I don't create phrases, but there have been times, like a perfect example is the 35th anniversary of the Al Michaels and I did of that fight.
Yes.
That was a completely uncharacteristic call of a fight by me. Even an exciting fight. If you, let's say...
In terms of how animated you were?
Pardon?
In terms of how animated you were?
Yeah, exactly. And if you take that call and juxtapose it to some other real exciting fights, like the Diego Corrales-Castillo fight, which was recently re-aired on Showtime, my call is different. Now, that was kind of a one-off, but it, and yet I've received, a fair amount of praise for that call. And I even some of it was organic, like at the end of the first round when I said this is one of the best rounds in middleweight history. I'm not given to those kind of statements, but I said it nonetheless. And so I could look at certain calls and say, well, that was, uncharacteristic for me. But then again, maybe parts of it worked. But really, I don't look at that call and I'm not thrilled with it. I'm not, I did do some of the things that that I normally do and that I think are appropriate. So I don't think I was recalcitrant, but it wasn't where I would normally be. And if you look at if you go back over time and look at my calls of fights, I don't think they're going to vary dramatically. And I think if there is it's both my curse and my strength. I am not. I have been mostly my goal at the beginning was to age well. And I don't mean age in terms of my age, but I wanted to. Boxing's not a sport that has a season. I felt, and back then I was doing 45 to 47 fights a year on the Top Rank Boxing Show on ESPN, plus some pay-per-view. So I was averaging maybe 50 fights a year. I did not want people to be sick of me. I didn't want them to. Feel like, oh God, I got to hear his voice again. Now, sportscasting has changed dramatically over the years, and so now it's a much more bombastic endeavor. But that was my approach. It helped me in terms, I think, of me wearing well with people. But I will say it also probably in some ways prevented me from certain, how can I put this, being noticed or being front and center for certain things that if I had been more bombastic, I might have been.
Your reaction to the more bombastic style that you see among color commentators and whatnot, do you just take it for what it is and you just like the stay in your lane? Any reaction to that?
Well, look, I wrote in my book, wrote a book, 30 Years, 30 Undeniable Truths, and I devoted a whole chapter to this. And one of the things that I said was that sportscasting really started to change in the early 90s when, and it started at ESPN, though they're not it's not, and I was there at the time, when they wanted more, both in studio shows and even in doing events, they wanted more controversy and they wanted arguments. They felt that was they wanted it to be opinion-based, driven more than anything else. And that became the norm for sportscasting. And there were a couple of parts to that. One, I always say Howard Cosell was the father of modern sportscasting, even though he didn't know it at the time. He was, Howard Cosell is revered in many places, and he did do a number of good things like introducing real world into sports, and that will forever be his legacy, that he made sportscasting into something that had to do with the real world. However, he also made sporting events completely about him. And I always use as an example, which I did in my book, that in the 15th round or 14th round of Ali Spinks, the second fight, he spent half the round reciting the lyrics to Bob Dylan's song "Forever Young." Now you have to have some real cojones to do that. Who knows what's going to happen in the fight, and I view that as him calling attention more to himself doing that than the actual fighters or the fight. And my big problem with the way sportscasting has kind of evolved is that there is way too much emphasis put on people announcing a live sporting event, but three people sitting there debating a topic while the sporting event is happening.
When the focus should be on the sporting event itself.
Right. It should be on the athletes or the sporting event. And I'm not saying that you can't discuss something that has to do with that event briefly, like, if you're doing a fight and I don't know, whether it's Floyd Mayweather or Oscar De La Hoya or anybody, you might say something about their position in the sport as it relates to that fight, even during the fight. But I don't think that even this, I don't think you should sit there and debate during round two whether he or somebody else is the best pound for pound fighter in the world. You could do that before the fight, you could do it after the fight, you could do it in a studio setting, but you don't want to do it there. And the other thing that's changed in sportscasting is that opinions now trump insider information. Because there's a difference even between insight and opinions. There's a difference. Insight is something that you're using either anecdotal information or statistical information or something you've gleaned to inform that insight. Opinions can just be opinions. I can say, I think that guy's the best middleweight in the world. Okay, that's an opinion, and that's okay. But if that's all you're going to do, then I'm sorry, I could be talking to the guy at the bar who's sitting next to me who has no information at hand and might not know the sport, whatever sport it is. And so unfortunately, that trend in sportscasting and the trend to say outrageous things just for the sake of saying it, to me, has altered it dramatically.
In other words, saying a fighter is a great fighter, as opposed to saying because fighter A does this, and this, that what makes him so good.
Well, that's part of it, right? Yeah, exactly. And that would have bearing on that fight. For instance, if you're doing a fight and you see something, and this is very true, and let's say you're doing a replay, and you demonstrate, you talk about something that's happening during the replay, that usually gives you an opportunity, and I'll refer back to, let's say, Mayweather as an example, because we did a number of Mayweather fights, and I would do a replay, and oftentimes it would be a classroom, depiction of why he was so good, why he was so special. And to me, that's pertinent sportscasting. But just to be sitting there debating whether, or using hyperbole to, I just think it's the lazy way out. I just think that, but it's what, we've become kind of, both in terms of the during events and sportscasting, whether it's on radio, and I did a daily radio show for 5 years, so I've done most of the things I'm talking about at various times, but whether you're in a studio doing a TV show, the thing about sportscasting now is I never really know, to be honest with you, in many cases, I don't really know if that's that person's opinion or if they think that's just a good opinion to do because it will get them attention. And that, to me, that's the death knell. Because I can listen to, I don't mind hearing people give their opinions. I don't mind seeing a studio show where there's not an event and people are giving opinions. I'd like them to back it up with something, but I don't mind that. That's fun sometimes, because just like when we're all sitting in, at home or over a drink, we can be talking that way. I don't mind hearing that, but I'd like to know it's for real. If you and I are having a drink, and we're trying to discuss whether we think that, Muhammad Ali and Lennox Lewis, who would win in that fight, and we talk about it and we have an opinion. That's okay, but I'd like to know it's really our opinion.
Right, right. And if you're gonna make that opinion, give something to back that opinion.
Drink, but if that opinion's being given on TV, and it's just because that person, and I don't think I need to mention any names about the dozens of sportscasters that do this, if it's just to get attention for that sportscaster, then I don't know, why am I listening?
Right. You could just watch cable news for a bunch of opinions, for that matter.
Right.
Couple of questions. You mentioned how you basically, before we close things down. One main question. You mentioned how you basically look in the mirror and critique yourself in terms of how you, as one of the reasons you've improved over the years. We all, whether fans, we have fighters that we look at from back in the past and say we like this guy because of this style and whatnot. Fighters look at each other, at other fighters, and want to try to emulate them or look at them as a standard bearer, how to act in the ring and out of the ring. As an announcer, on the come up, when you decided this is what you wanted to do,
Right.
Who did you look to?
Yeah, that's a good question. The dean of all boxing announcers, of course, was Don Dunphy.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, and I really got a special gift. Don was, and again, this is boxing. The sports was different. He was a singular voice doing fights alone, and had to serve as both the color and the commentator, the play-by-play and color commentator. He had a very sparse style. He didn't overtalk the event. And Don, I got to know Don because in I'm going to say 85, we were going to change the fights. The ESPN fights were going to Friday, and so it was going to be Friday night at the fight. So they said we should interview Don Dunphy, and I had never met Don Dunphy. And of course, this was, when I was a kid, I used to sit and watch boxing with my dad when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and my dad passed away when I was 12. And so some of my best memories were watching those fights with him, and he was a big boxing fan. And so meeting Don Dunphy, it was like reliving those moments with my dad. It was kind of emotional. And he turned out to be exactly what I would have expected him to be. Just a wonderful guy, a gentleman. And we became friends, and he was a mentor to me. And ironically, his son, Bob Dunphy, is the director of the boxing on Showtime. Bob directed the fights at CBS, and he's directed our Showtime fights in all the years I've been there. So the Dunphy family, plays an important part in my life as a broadcaster. And so Don was the play-by-play guy. So I wasn't going to do play-by-play, but as an analyst, here's the best analyst of boxing that I have ever seen, but he does it all differently than me, is Gil Clancy. Gil Clancy was a great trainer, and he approached it from the standpoint of a trainer. Now, he did his due diligence in knowing about the fighters, but he wasn't likely to toss in the anecdotal material that, let's say, I feel obligated to do. But he was a great, great analyst. But I couldn't learn from Gil Clancy exactly. I could only learn about boxing from Gil Clancy. I couldn't learn about what style I was supposed to use. And this is where I hope this is not going to sound arrogant or braggadocious. I kind of had to invent. I was a journalist, unknown, relatively unknown. I'd written a couple books on boxing when I got the ESPN job. I had no credibility to people. So I had to earn that credibility, both in terms of what I was going to say about the fights, and I had to bring information into it. Or else, what was I going to say? Why would you, I was a 30-year-old guy who'd written about boxing and had been an amateur boxer, but nobody cared about that. So I had no credibility. I had to do enough analysis of the fight to convince people I knew what I was talking about, and then provide information. Well, guess what? In 1980, there was nobody who was in that situation. There was no analyst. They were either all trainers or fighters or for the most part. So I had to kind of create a certain style of broadcasting. And, following me then after that were people like Steve Farhood, who, of course, is a valued colleague now. He followed closely on my footsteps. Rich Murata, Dave Bontempo. Now people like Chris Mannix and Kriegel and other people that are going to sit at ringside. But I was the first one of that, and I had to kind of create a style that worked. So I didn't really have I had mentors like Don and like Gil Clancy, but I couldn't pick from them what to do as an analyst. Now, as a play-by-play guy, I very much had role models. Sal Marciano, who I worked with for the first couple of years, Sam Rosen, who was a great broadcaster, Steve Albert, who I then later got to work with at Showtime. I very much studied their styles. And Barry Tompkins, who, of course, was my partner for 8 years at ESPN, I very much listened to them and would literally I didn't copy them, but I would take elements of what they did. And I've always said that my play-by-play, when I do play-by-play in a boxing, it's an amalgamation of all those people.
How important is the interplay, the synergy between announcer and color commentary, the guy who breaks down?
Well, I think it can make a broadcast, 25% better or whatever percent. If you have a certain synergy, you don't want to be sitting there having a discussion. Again, I'm opposed to that. I don't believe in discussing boxing matches. I believe in calling it, but that doesn't mean you don't have interaction, you don't have brief discussion. If you interact well with each other, if you can interact about the event correctly and on a personal basis, we all like to hear people say something that's off topic for 2 seconds. It's kind of fun. If you can do that, it makes the viewer, I believe it makes the viewer comfortable at home. Listen, I'm in the music world. I've been a vocalist for 30-some years, and my wife was a singer for 35 years, and she always had a thing that she said to me. She said, you might go see a musical act, and you don't know why you're uncomfortable. Like, they might be just they might be rushing the meter when they sing, or they might be just a hair out of tune here or there, and you're not sure the reasons why, but you're a little uncomfortable. Well, I would suggest that when broadcasters are not in sync with each other and they're not working together, and you don't feel the camaraderie between them, it's a little uncomfortable to you, even if you don't know why you feel uncomfortable. And so I think that broadcasters that can work together effectively and they interact well, it's going to make the broadcast that much better.
And I think we're going to start to shut the interview down on this note, because we was only supposed to go maybe 35 minutes because the conversation was so good. We went a little bit long. I hope I learned something. I hope those who are listening will learn something too. One last word from you. Given our current situation dealing with this pandemic, any last words for boxing fans and whatnot who are sitting there antsy, waiting for a fight to happen? Any last word for the folks as we are dealing with this current crisis?
I think we're all, we're from that standpoint of the sport and how we perceive it and how we're looking forward to it. I mean, obviously, people have taken this opportunity to look back at a lot of great fights. They've been shown on Showtime and on ESPN and other places. So it's a great time for that, to kind of go back and reflect on the sport. And the other thing is, I think we're all impatient. I think we have to be fair in the way we look at the sport coming back. We're certainly going to get some good fights. We don't know what we're going to see. Hopefully the fighters will have trained long enough so that they can perform at their peak. But we may see some fits and starts from the sport as it comes back. And boxing fans are not known for their patience or their nuanced reactions sometimes to the sport. But I hope they can find it in themselves to do that, so that they can give everyone an opportunity to to work through these bumps that will be in the road. You know, we're headed into uncharted territory. All sports are. You know, basketball, boxing, or basketball, football, baseball will be, and boxing is no exception, just like mixed martial arts. So I hope fans will kind of take that into account and say, okay, you know, maybe not everything about this situation is going to be perfect for me, but I'd still like to, you know, enjoy it. And I do want to mention, I did kind of a shameless plug before, but I'd like to do one before we leave. I hope fans will get a chance to look at my to watch and listen to my podcast. It's called Al Bernstein Unplugged, and it's on YouTube and Spotify and Google and Apple and all those places. So I hope they will get a chance to look at it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. For those who want to talk boxing or anything else with you, I follow you on Twitter, and you have quite the interesting commentary that goes outside the sport. I really enjoy it, particularly when you dive into politics. Let the folks know where they can find you.
Yeah, they can go to Al Bernstein on Twitter, and I do. It's a pretty eclectic Twitter feed. I do talk boxing about 80% of the time, but the other 20% you might get pop culture. Occasionally I throw in some politics, although I try and stay away from that as much as possible. But I do like to talk about pop culture and music and other sports as well. So that's a place where they can get to me. And part of the thing that I did with my podcast was I included the fact that people could tweet me questions on Twitter, and I would answer. I try to answer a lot of those questions on the podcast. So that's a place where they can interact with me a little bit.
Again, I want to thank Ada Zuckerman for her work behind the scenes, organizing this interview. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with the one and only, the Hall of Famer. The Hall of Famer. Let me repeat that again. The Hall of Famer, Al Bernstein. This is Michael W., host of Pound for Pound Box Report and Three Kings Boxing, senior writer for Three Kings Boxing. Again, Al Bernstein, I really, really want to thank you for taking the time out to be a part of this interview. It's really been a pleasure.
You're welcome. More than welcome.
Thank you. Hope to have this conversation again.
All right. Take care.
And I really hope you enjoyed listening to that exclusive interview with the Hall of Famer himself, Al Bernstein. Not only did I hope you enjoyed what you heard, I hope you were really paying attention, because he was dropping some major jewels in terms of what it takes to be a good color commentator and the key to his success over the years. If you want to find out all things regarding Pound for Pound Boxing Report, the blog page is the place to go to, p4pboxingreport.wordpress.com. Check the top right of the blog page. You will find links to where to follow us all over social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. The links to where you can donate at a Cash Me and PayPal donation link. And links to where to find the podcast on all platforms that carry RSS feed, such as iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Google Podcasts. We're everywhere. And last but certainly not least, Three Kings Boxing, your source for pure, unadulterated boxing information, news, and entertainment. ThreeKingsBoxing.com is the place you want to go to. They're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as well. So all things boxing related, all over social media. Three Kings Boxing is the place to go to. They also got a YouTube podcast as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed what you just heard. My exclusive interview with the Hall of Famer, Al Bernstein, for Three Kings Boxing and Pound for Pound Boxing Report.